everyone, and welcome to tonight's Hot Topics. Once again, we're in our new setup here. We are enjoying our new space. We hope that you will too. And tonight, we just want to welcome you to our conversation. My name is Ilse, and tonight we'll be hosting along with Hloni as well as Rebekah. And then we've got two special guests that are joining us tonight. We've got Rivas and we've got Paul Verrain who are joining us. So Paul and Jackie, you both have been ministers in the MCSA for quite a while. Paul, you've been a bishop over the years as well. And Jackie, you've been a superintendent. Maybe as a way to start our conversation tonight, as we start speaking about different churches and different things, could you maybe just give us a little bit of an idea of the congregations that you've pastored and that you've been able to minister into? Just some contextual questions around that.
Good evening, everyone. It's really good to be with you. So I've been thinking quite a bit about the churches I've pastored, and I haven't really pastored many. So that's just a fact. I've had the privilege of being the superintendent of the four-way circuit. There are quite a few churches in that, so you play a role as the superintendent. But I've technically been a pastor in 3 churches. Bryanston Methodist Church, Trinity Methodist Church, and then Gracepoint.
So I started in the Eastern Cape. In Uitenhage, and there I was responsible for a church in Dispatch and the youth work in that circuit generally, and then 2 rural congregations, one in Glenconnell and the other in Springbok Flats, which is quite near Janssenville. And I was there as what they called a presidentially appointed prospective candidate. I moved from there to Transkei, southern Transkei, and I had a church in Butterworth, and a church in Idutwa, and a church in Willowvale, and I started a church in Xologa, because that's where all my congregation went over the weekends, and we started that in a bar. I was moved from there up to Roodepoort, and then I was moved to Soweto, to the Orlando, which is now the Orlando circuit, but was the Orlando section of the Jabavu circuit, and then I was moved to Central Methodist, where I was a superintendent, and as the superintendent was responsible for all the inner city churches. So there was the main church, there was Braamfontein, there was Albert Street, there was Selby 1, there was Selby 2, there was Overton and Crown Mines, and we did a bit of work in the universities there. And at the same time, I was in the Soweto Community Center, have worked all over the country.
Thank you so much. So my reason for asking you these questions tonight is because tonight we start a brand new series called My Church or Your Church. And what we're looking at is how we find that the church is different expressions and how it's differently expressed across different denominations, across different countries, but also what are some of the fundamental differences and how did they come about? And then we also want to explore between ourselves and everyone at home how the church continues to unfold and how we should never stop asking the question, what is church? And what does it mean to us contextually? So, Hloni, maybe you want to just kick us off with tonight's topic and what we're speaking about specifically.
Absolutely. So I think with everyone here that is sitting, Rebekah, Ilse, and I, we always trying to imagine new ways of doing church, and you've had the experience of literally leading churches and also experiencing how the church continues to realize, or rather to unfold over the years. So when we look at from the early church, there's been over 1,000 denominations that have since been born. There's been different expressions of church that has come out since that particular era. And just a question to all of us here is, for some people, it has been a tragic moment in history when there's been breakaways because of different things that people desire to emphasize and different church teachings that people wanted to consider. And yet for other people, it's been a moment of blessing when we look back and we say, hey, look, without Luther doing what he did, we probably wouldn't have what we have today. So in your view, what has it been? Is it a tragic moment when there are breakaways, or is it a blessing that forces the church to reimagine and consider its identity in the emerging context?
I think that's such an interesting question because I think that just as a person, and actually obviously growing up with my mom and my dad and my brother, they've always preached unity and always never judge anyone that's different to you. And so that's always what my parents have preached. But it's quite funny that I've also grown up a Methodist. I don't think I've ever, besides last year, ever gone to a church that isn't a Methodist church. I mean, when I was younger, my mom used to go visit Paul at Central in the middle of Joburg, and she used to drag Daniel and I, drag being the wrong word, but take Daniel and I to Central. So it's all I've known. Like, I've known the Methodist church. Actually, as far back as I can remember, I've known Paul's been in my life. So when you speak about like people breaking away and stuff like that, I think the way in which denominations can judge each other can be quite difficult, but I think that it is important. And the place that I speak from is I served in an Anglican church for a year and a half, and even though John Wesley obviously died in Anglican, there were these really different things that Anglicans did to what we did, and there's something I think important about the different traditions, but I think that it becomes quite harmful when it's, oh, you're a Methodist, or oh, you're an Anglican, or oh, and it ends up being this rivalry between denominations. And I remember walking in to the church that I was serving at, and the guy was preaching, and he was preaching about like how God can heal today, and he can heal tomorrow, he can heal in your bedroom, or like in the church building. And I remember just standing there being like, that's not true. There's only a healing service in November once a year. Like, I remember thinking, like, who's going to go and tell this guy that he's got it wrong? Like, I was, like, genuinely, I was so confused by this. And then over the year and a half being there, it just unpacks that no one's right, no one's wrong, but there's a different like theology around things, which I think can be really, really difficult. And I find myself often deconstructing my faith because of the different denominations.
So you're saying the breakaway can be a blessing?
I think it can be a blessing and a curse, and I think it literally finds itself split down the middle. I do, because I think that there can be like this really, it's our way or the highway, and we've got it right.
But what I want to ask maybe from you guys is, what are some of the most fundamental differences you believe we find across different denominations, different churches, and why are they there? You know, and do they even matter? Or are we just all just expressing things in a different way that suits our purposes?
So this week, for instance, I've got a meeting which is called a meeting of the committee that deals with the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification by faith, the JDDJ meeting.
Of course it has an
abbreviation. And what happened in 1999, for instance, is that these people got together from the Catholic Church, the senior theologians of the Catholic Church, and the Lutheran Church. And in actual fact, the then secretary of the Lutheran Federation, World Federation, will be in our meeting on Tuesday. And they began to ask the question, you know, what divides us? What divides us? Your question, basically. And they got to a place of agreement around the fundamental thing that Luther raised, which was you are justified by faith. Okay? Full stop. And what does that really mean? Well, it just means you're made right with God when you say yes to Christ. That's really what justification is, very, very fundamentally. I mean, it's a much more complicated thing than that when theologians get hold of it and really try to confuse people, but that's what it's about. But, for instance, where it became significant 500 years ago was that Luther was saying the paraphernalia that has come into the Catholic Church is actually not the essence of what creates the relationship with God. So he challenged issues around penance and absolution and the priesthood of all believers, a whole lot of things. Also, one of the things that he got his knickers in a knot about were all the statues and all that kind of stuff in the churches, because it was seen as idolatry, and a lot of what he raised had to do with power relations. And they did two things. The Catholics came to the place of saying, actually what Luther said is the truth, which was a massive move. And the second thing was that both the Lutherans and the Catholics then said, we've now got to get rid of what they call the anathemas. And those are the things that say, if you do that, you're not a Christian, and you're not part of the Church of Christ, and so on. And let me say, some of it was tragic. Some of it ended up in full-scale wars. And the French Inquisition and the slaughtering of people because of tiny, minuscule disagreements, which now 500 years later we've come to resolve. That happened in 1999 between the Catholics and the Lutherans. In 2004, the Methodists joined that movement. And in 2017, the Anglicans and the whole Reformed family, that's the Dutch Reformed, the Uniting Reformed, the Presbyterians and the congregation joined into that. This coming week, we are going to try and see what are the anathemas, in other words, the things that Methodists struggle with, Anglicans with, because if we can get rid of some of those things, then we can be a united church. But then let me also say that a lot of what we do is affected by our culture and our value systems. So for instance, let me say to you, I came from a lily white church in Witpoortjie. You understand? The only black people who came to that church at that stage in 1984 were people who stayed in my house. And it was not unlike some of the worship. We had a little worship group. We sang many more hymns than Gracepoint, for instance. And then I moved into Soweto. And I want to tell you that my move into Soweto introduced me to a completely different way of working. So at that church, it was hardly possible to imagine that you could have a church service without what they call umbedesho. And umbedesho was the order of service that went back to 1652. Translated, of course, mostly into Xhosa. And in that service, the siyakhudumisa, which is the tedium, which was a central piece of praise that came from the Reformation, was impossible. It was impossible to think that you had worshipped if you did not sing the siyakhudumisa. And then let me just say, just a half a smidgen, one could understand it. You had people who were suffering profoundly, many of them in the church, from the oppression of apartheid. And when you come to the end of the siyakhudumisa, it says, Nkosi nditembe wena, ma ndingaze didaniswe, which is, oh my God, in you I have put my trust. Let me never be confused.
You know, Paul, you speak about the power of our experience of worship and just how I suppose different things hold that. And over the last couple of years, I mean, I sit And I listen to the churches that you've pastored, and I think to myself, oh my goodness, I only have 3 on my list. And like, does that make me a bad minister, you know? But one of the things that's fascinated me in this journey of the expression of worship is, you know, what is the definition of church? What is church, particularly in the 21st century? And there were a group of theologians who got together focusing on the practice of theology and practical theology, which is like an interesting, you know, kind of 21st century thinking about theology. Yeah. And they spoke about 4 things. And they spoke about there are normative aspects of theology that get passed down, pretty much like the creeds, like the Te Deum, and we hold them. We hold them as if they are the norms that become our constructs. And so asking, you know, well, what are the norms that we really hold to? And I do think that norms are different in different expressions of worship, but there are norms, like our doctrines and our creeds. And it seems as if we are holding similar norms across all denominations, you know. And then there are what creates the formalities around our worship, which is our style of worship. We sometimes get confused that our churches are defined theologically and doctrinally by the styles. They're not. It's just an expression of theology, being a formative expression of theology that forms those people for any set time, you know, that becomes the expression. But the piece that obviously I've been interested in is the definition of what becomes your espoused and your operant expressions of worship. You know, how do we operate and what is it that we say about what we do? Because is our worship is the way we worship, is that the theological essence of who we are as a community, as a church? And I think COVID has really forced us into a reimagination of that. You know, we've not been able to gather in a way that we would usually have gathered. So, you know, it's not really shifted our norms, because normative stuff is just, you know, in fact, very often the normative stuff holds us in these places. Like I've often read about how the liturgy, the lectionary holds our pieces of humanity together when we're fractured by world events. So those are critical. But it's the espoused and the operant. And I think that's what I've enjoyed, you know, most about a new church. You know, for me, it's like, you know, are you legitimate because you are new? Because I do believe that that's the question that you kind of raise. Let's start a new church. And strangely enough, I would love to be a Catholic. You know, but I'm just saying, it's like there's a sense of connected belonging is important. So I do think, and as a Methodist church, whether we like it or not, we are a split off based on all sorts of other reasons, you know. And so there is always a temptation in our ego to go in that direction. And I mean, personally, I think as a minister, that's the great struggle. You know, I think that the structures of the church do not serve us well. You know, I think that, and I'm not talking about the Methodist Church in particular, but structure doesn't serve us. You know, and when I think of Wesley, I think that he's becomes this prophetic mission driver, and everyone who follows in the leadership of any hierarchical structure tries to force themselves into that mantle, but end up doing administration and report on efficiency. And that's not where the church is effective, you know, so, yeah.
Sure, thank you so much. Now, there is something that it's a French priest said about the Reformation, and speaking about the Reformation. Now, he says, had power balances been different when Luther raised the issues that he raised, had the church been at a different place, chances are the Lutheran would not necessarily be a Lutheran church, but it could have been a movement within the Catholic Church. It could have been something within the Catholic Church. And what I'm now interested in is that as young people, there's a lot of things, maybe not only as young people actually, there's people who want to think outside of the box. There's a lot of things that we are challenged by and that we constantly find ourselves wanting to leave, or rather we constantly find ourselves challenged and wanting to leave the church because the church does not want to deal with these issues. You know, you speak to Rebekah, she'll tell you about LGBTQ plus community, the way women are being treated. Is there a way in which we can learn lessons from this past? You know, so that we deal with issues in such a way that young people do not, 1, break away, 2, leave the church, which is what we're most likely to do, and instead they can actually reimagine the kind of church they want to see within the church without feeling as though protocol and process is making it impossible and difficult.
I just think that's so interesting. I read a statistic the other day that spoke about how Generation Z is the most tolerant generation that has ever been. And I think the church is in big trouble when, not Methodist Church, the global church. And I know it's dangerous to make sweeping statements, and that's not my intention, but I think we are in a very dangerous place as a global church because Generation Zs, and I think maybe the back half of millennials, will come into a church and they are able to sniff out authenticity. They're able to sniff out discrimination and injustice. And I think it's brilliant. I think it's a long time coming, to be honest with you. And I think that's where the church, I know in a few weeks' time we're doing something called Church on the Wrong Side of History again. And I think that's the danger we find ourselves in as denomination. And I do have, and this is not the time, but I think non-denominational stuff, I think not being accountable to a bigger and older, I don't want to say organization, but denomination, I think it can be dangerous. I've seen it in so many non-denominational churches that I've gone to, but I think that the church needs to have a dynamic shift because Generation Zs will leave. I think that they are the most outspoken generation, and I think that that's where, and just for example, I mean, if we take away the LGBTQI plus argument, if we take away the women argument, if we take away the Black Lives Matter argument, that shouldn't be the reason that churches are shifting. Because churches just need to be decent. Do you know what I mean? It can't be, well, because the Black Lives Matter movement exists, let's form an opinion. Do you know what I mean? It can't be because of that. It needs to be because Jesus was a radical, brown-skinned immigrant. You know, that needs to be the reason that things shift, and not because there's an organization or a movement. And that's what Generation Zs are going to be able to sniff out, and what Generation Zs are going to make. They're going to be holding people accountable, and churches accountable. And if we think that Generation Zs are radical, we've got to just wait for the generation after that. The point is, denominations, I think, get a little bit caught up too much on the political side of church, and actually what really matters is how we love people. Yeah.
No, thank you for that.
Maybe repeat the question.
No, you're absolutely right. So I think some of the stuff that you mentioned that are related to the question that maybe some of us at home might relate to is the frustrations that we have as young people going into a church that is not speaking about issues around Black Lives Matter, but a church that is reactionary to such issues. You know, but then from Paul and Jackie, as people who have led churches, so here's Rebekah with her radical thinking. She comes into your church. How do you make sure that you handle the concerns that she has in a way that it does not lead to her starting her own church, but it leads to her saying, well, look, I've got a place to imagine within this church that I'm already at?
So I don't know, Paul, maybe you can help here. So my sense of point of departure, and it might be a reactionary point of departure, and I don't want it necessarily to be. But you know, I kind of still come from the place of we need to be careful about subjective morphing into you know, whatever the current demands are. Now, that's not to speak about contextual, prophetic imprinting of the gospel message, you know. So I worry a little bit when it's the church in my image, you know, the church in my need, the church in itching where it's currently, scratching where it's currently itching. So my sense is that why I probably enjoy John Wesley because he was able to shift in a radical way, socially appropriately, in terms of his social justice movement, in terms of his, I suppose it's simply spreading scriptural holiness and through evangelical faith. You know, that's the Methodist movement. But that just looks different. So the difficulty for me is you know, do you have a product that you're trying to deliver to be consumed by a person, and then the person that hits the market share in the right way gets to make the money? bottom line, because that feels to me a little bit of where the pressure is. So I want to say that the church is going to exist with radicalized Gen Zs or not, and I know that's kind of like pushback at you because and that's just the truth. The church is going to exist past the needs of Gen Z. I mean, yes, maybe differently, but it's kind of like, I don't know if we build churches to fit the need, or I don't know, Paul, I don't know, maybe that's just, I get worried where there is I think the church must be afraid to be reactionary, but it must still be prophetic. So I think there's a fine line, and I'm not sure, I think what you did in Central was mind-blowing, and it was church in the most effective way of actually being church, and yet there's been a reaction to that, but that hasn't changed how church has been and how church could be.
Just on that quickly, I don't think Gen Zs are going to abolish the church. I think that people have been trying to do that since the church began. That's not my suggestion. My suggestion is that the Gen Zs are going to call the church to account, and that I'm not saying that the church needs to. Because I agree with you, we are in this world, not of this world. And there are things that we're going to say that's going to be so countercultural. And we can't just adapt and be like, oh, well, because it's going this way, we're going to be this way. The church is always going against the current. And I love that about the church. But I think that the Gen Zs and Generation Younger are just going to mold it and shift the viewpoint and the trajectory in a different way. I think that was my suggestion. Less than I think the church would withstand anything as it has, and I'm glad it has. I just think that instead of exactly what Hloni said, and actually exactly what you said, instead of it being reaction, we always seem to be a bit on the back foot when things happen, and I think it's important just to be, I did not mean to suggest that the church would be overrun or destroyed by Gen Zs at all.
I think the point to make is will be irrelevant.
Yeah,
that's far worse than being overrun. I'd rather be overrun or destroyed than be irrelevant.
So I want to take it back a step maybe and just come back to what Rebekah spoke about, how the Gen Zs and those generations don't really care so much about things like the debate about baptism and communion and those things. But I do believe that as a church, it's important that we understand why there are differences in things like that. Why is it that we have split churches over the issue of baptism? Why is it that we cannot have communion as, an ecumenical congregation? If we gather, why is it that we cannot agree on one way to have communion? Where does that come from? And how do we find a way to worship together as the church with a capital C, as a global church, despite the different expressions? How do we find a way to worship together?
Well, maybe the word I must come to, which is the word that separates us quite substantially, is the word liturgy. And it comes from two Greek words, meaning the work of the people. And so, if you can imagine, if we did that work properly, you with me? If we had to ask, what is the work of God in this place for the people? And how do we shape the time we spend together in worship to reflect that work? And you will know that in the church, you've got such a variety of people in the church. For instance, the big word when I was busy studying around church was relevance. Is what is being said relevant? And I must be honest with you, I often don't find the Methodist Church form of worship fits my expectation. So I do sometimes go to church and I'm bored out of my cotton-picking mind. You understand? Because people turn their habits into idols. The word church means those who are called out. Called out of what? Called out of a context to address the context, to have compassion on the context, to engage the context, to change the context. You with me? And it's not meant to be a sort of comfortable armchair experience where I go back into the old hymns and I can sit over there. The words are absolutely unimportant. You want to invest in the death of that particular church. Don't put in place a strategy that opens up the space for young people. And if you're going to open up the space for young people, it's going to mean that they're going to have to come to church scruffy, just as they are, and feel welcome. They're going to want different music. They've got a short attention span, so you understand. If you really are going to be serious about the fact that you want a church to be a church, not for the sake that it's a kind of future insurance company, but to take seriously the words that Jesus spoke about young people carrying and the essence of truth for the present community. You better be, that's work. And really, many older people of 60, 70, 80 come to church to have a Sunday afternoon nap. And that might be wonderful for them, and it might be absolutely peaceful, and it might send them on a happy trip to Jesus. But I think that is plain, straightforward heresy. If you're going to come to church, you come to church to work. So in Soweto on a Sunday night, we have all these little pests for old people. Little children of 3 and 4 years old who've got their own damn agenda, and they've got to learn the different parts of their body. So the person who does them, they do it, but they're wonderful. They're absolutely wonderful. And they're now coming from all over and around, and they take up a major part of the service. Now you can imagine somebody as important as me having to sit and listen to this, but it's very important, because this is a place of their belonging, this is a place of their socialization, this is a place in which they will discover their value. And you can imagine the rest of the congregation over there are all mostly were at one stage unaccompanied minors from Zimbabwe. And so when there is a smidgen of xenophobia anywhere, you must understand that my sermon changes radically, because I've got to talk to people that I want to be ready for danger, for death, possibly. You with me? And so I do think that the shift that we're beginning to see actually doesn't bother about whether you were 2 months old and couldn't make an answer for yourself before you were baptized, or whether you're going to be baptized by a little driplet on your head or a whole big swimming pool that you're going to immerse yourself. You know, quite frankly, those idiosyncrasies are completely irrelevant. And we've got to ask ourselves the question, I mean, I'm terribly sorry to tell you that Jesus didn't spend too much time in the synagogue. He did his major teachings on a hillside or from a fishing boat, a smelly fishing boat. He walked the streets. He connected with people in places that the church is definitely not interested in. You with me? And that gave him an irrepressible relevance. How on earth? You know, we've got much bigger populations than in the time of Jesus. How on earth do you think he managed to get? There were probably 15,000 people on a hillside, because they keep on telling you that there were 5,000 men on there, besides women and children, because women and children, of course, aren't irrelevant in today's world. How on earth did he do that? And the people of those days were not stupid. They They knew the fine details, many of them, on what, for instance, was meant by honor your father and mother. They had scrutinized that stuff down to a fine tooth comb. But he had a kind of radical, whatever it is.
So just Paul, just one silly statement. I mean, I imagine that hillside, and then I kind of look at pictures of churches, and churches are mostly shut. It is beyond my belief system. I struggle with the idea of shutting a church. When I mean shutting, I mean barring a church, locking a church, securing a church. I mean, I find it like quite strange when you go past a church and you see all this barbed wire and this security, and I'm like, that church has got a problem in the community, because the minute you have to start barbed wiring and putting alarm bells left, right, and center, that means your relevance in the community. We literally should be open fields to a community where people should be able to access all the time.
Paul, you really triggered something. And that is when you spoke about things that matter and things that do not matter. And I find that theologians are very brilliant at complicating very simple things. Generation Z has been saying this, millennials have been saying this, that there are things that matter and there are things that really have to take priority. But it seems like, once again, when you do not have mileage to your years, the assumption is that you are not in touch with tradition, and because of what you're protesting for, you are basically undermining tradition. I was so bummed when Rebekah wanted to withdraw her statements. I was hoping that she'll challenge Jackie and say, no, this is what I'm actually saying. The thing is, we would say so many things without using theological language. When the Fallist movement says decolonize education, and then it goes on to say decolonize religion, it has to first go through church elders into a university, back as an academic program, and only then it becomes official synod business. And then it's going to go through synod.
And then it's saying,
and then back to synod again. There's going to be this boomerang for 10 years.
If you like.
And then it's taken seriously, because we would be older by then, so we'd be equally ageist. Why does it always have to be that? And I'm just throwing that out there, and then Ilse, over to you.
So maybe we'll leave it there for tonight. So we just want to invite everyone to join us for our Hot Topics Tuesday night chats, which will be starting this week. We are changing our times from 8 p.m. We'll be doing it at 7 p.m., but same place on Zoom. We look forward to having you join us. Jackie and Paul, Rebekah, Hloni, thank you for the conversation we've had tonight. And we just wish you all a blessed week, and we'll see you again next week.